Many countries tried to obtain nuclear weapons, and so far 10 have succeeded, which we looked at in a recent video. But there are at least 17 others that also had a secret weapons program. A few came extremely close, having fully designed bombs and carrying out cold tests of nuclear devices. Many of them have already done most of the work and are called threshold states, meaning they could very easily create nukes if they wanted to. The reasons they haven't completed the process yet varies. Some were incentivized not to, some failed due to the immense costs or government changes, and others were stopped by international pressure and even direct military attacks and sabotage, destroying their facilities. Today, there are also countries currently attempting to create nukes, but most are these threshold states, so if circumstances change, many more nations could quickly get them. This is every country that tried to obtain nuclear weapons and the ones still trying. Germany was among the first countries in the world trying to develop nuclear weapons during World War II, as well as Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Japan, who were all in a secret race to try and figure out how to weaponize the recently discovered nuclear fission. The German physicist Werner Heisenberg was one of the pioneers of their program called the Uran project, which had three components: making a reactor, uranium and heavy water production, and uranium separation. But progress was slow and often halted as the German military believed nuclear fission would not have a significant benefit to their war efforts. The project struggled with limited resources, scientists being drafted into the army, and miscalculations about sustaining a chain reaction. There were also disagreements among the top physicists that were divided into many groups working separately and sometimes in competition with each other. As well as this, the German regime had also killed, imprisoned, and driven out many of the best Jewish scientists, which thinned their ranks and led to many of them fleeing to join the US's Manhattan Project. By 1942, the German leadership began to realize the importance of nuclear science for war and that driving out Jewish scientists was a huge mistake. They faced another setback when the Allies sabotaged a Norwegian plant occupied by Germany being used for heavy water production. As Germany began to lose the war, their nuclear program had ultimately failed and they were not at all close to producing a viable reactor or bomb. The Allies captured most of the German scientists and discovered how behind they really were. When Heisenberg, in Allied captivity, learned about the first atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, he didn't believe it was possible and then realized the mistakes in his calculations. In comparison, the United States spent today's equivalent of $35 billion on the Manhattan Project, whereas the Germans had spent only $35 million on theirs. After World War II, Germany was demilitarized and forbidden from developing or possessing nuclear weapons, but during the Cold War, the US and Soviets would deploy their own nukes in West and East Germany. Most were removed as Germany reunified, but today the United States still stores between 20 and 60 tactical nukes there, which the German Luftwaffe has been trained to use in a time of war. In 2007, the former defense secretary stated that Germany should strive to become a nuclear-armed power, to which the French president offered Germany to control some of the French nuclear arsenal. Chancellor Angela Merkel declined the offer, stating that Germany had no interest in possessing nuclear weapons, but she later reversed her stance due to the actions of Russia, and she stated, "As long as there are nuclear weapons in the world, we need to have those capabilities." Though they have shut down all of their nuclear energy plants, research in nuclear physics still continues, and Germany is considered a threshold state, meaning they could quickly develop weapons if they wanted to. Spain, under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, started nuclear energy research in 1951, which gradually evolved into also investigating a weapons program. In 1963, Project Islero was born with a 9-step plan to prioritize plutonium production, but the team struggled and admitted they had no idea how to achieve this. In 1966, luck would fall out of the sky. A US B-52 plane carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided mid-air with its refueling plane, dropping the thermonuclear bombs on Spain. They didn't fully detonate, but 2 of them partially exploded on impact with the ground and leaked radiation. Spanish scientists reverse engineered some of the fragments found, and this was a massive breakthrough for Spain, as countries always had to try and figure out how to make standard fission bombs first, and then would figure out fusion to make hydrogen or thermonuclear bombs, which can be 1,000 times more powerful. So Spain just got the biggest shortcut in history to the most powerful form of nuclear weapons. By the late 60s, Spain brought its first nuclear energy reactor online and started producing small amounts of weapons-grade plutonium from their vast natural uranium reserves. By 1971, a classified report said that they could create a bomb and test it in the Spanish Sahara colony. The French President Charles de Gaulle supplied them a graphite reactor design and technical help to produce more plutonium for a bomb. France wanted their neighbour and ally Spain to also become a nuclear-armed state to make them both more independent from NATO. The US grew increasingly concerned, and their Secretary of State Henry Kissinger met with the Spanish Prime Minister Carrero Blanco and asked for US support in the event of a war, but Kissinger refused. Blanco then showed him Spain's nuclear plans, which distressed Kissinger, who left Spain in a hurry later that day. The next morning, Blanco was assassinated when his car drove by a bomb planted by a Spanish separatist group that opposed Franco's regime. Soon after, Franco, who was in poor health, ordered to stop the costly weapons program and saw support from the US as more important than having nukes. After Franco died, the new prime minister continued the project, and the foreign minister said, "We could complete a bomb in 7 or 8 years if we set our minds to it." As Spain transitioned from a dictatorship into a democracy, the project still continued, and they planned a new plant that could create plutonium for 23 bombs a year. The alarmed US President Jimmy Carter threatened to freeze Spain's enriched uranium imports, which would impact their nuclear energy plants. By 1987, the new socialist government finally agreed to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and officially ended their nuclear weapons program too. Today, studies have shown that Spain easily has the technology and groundwork to develop nuclear weapons in a short amount of time, so it is considered a threshold state. Switzerland is famous for its long policy of neutrality, but surprisingly had a nuclear weapons program that lasted 43 years. During World War II, the Swiss physicist Paul Scherrer invited his German colleague Werner Heisenberg, who would later lead Germany's nuclear weapons program, to discuss the possibilities of an atom bomb. A week after the US's nuclear attack on Japan in 1945, the Swiss government began their own project led by Paul Scherrer, assuming that eventually most countries would also have them. In 1958, the Swiss government said, "The army must be given the most effective weapons for the preservation of our independence and neutrality. This includes nuclear weapons." The military recommended that they should have 100 bombs, 50 artillery shells, and 100 rockets within 15 years. There were also plans of where 7 underground tests could be carried out. They purchased uranium from the Belgian colony of Congo and secretly stored it in nuclear reactors purchased from the US. They strategized for a preemptive war against the Soviet Union with how nuclear warheads could be carried to Moscow by their Mirage 3 jets. They also planned for smaller tactical nukes that could be used on Swiss soil against an invasion. In the 1960s, the program was dealt serious setbacks. The Mirage affair was a public scandal that exposed huge flaws in the military budget and planning around the planes meant to carry the warheads. This cut most of the funding to the nuclear program, and then in 1969, a Swiss nuclear energy reactor built in a cave suffered a partial meltdown, and public support for the Swiss weapons program rapidly declined. Switzerland then signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and downshifted to only studying the acquisition of nuclear weapons in case the treaty broke down. As the Cold War was ending, their weapons program was completely dissolved in 1988, after 43 years where not much progress was made. In 2018, Switzerland decided not to sign a treaty banning nuclear weapons due to security concerns, and still holds this stance today, although it advocates strongly for a nuclear-free world. It is not considered a threshold state, and they could not acquire nuclear weapons easily. Sweden came extremely close to obtaining a nuclear weapon and was only months away from arming one to be tested. As early as 1948, Sweden officially started a well-funded and highly organized nuclear program with world-class Swedish physicists, as well as benefiting from large natural uranium deposits. Their program was, like many others, a secret part of their nuclear energy program. They planned to convert uranium into plutonium and secretly purchased 5 tons of heavy water from Norway to do this. As the Soviets tested their first nuke in 1949, Sweden focused on getting 100 smaller tactical nukes dropped by planes to be used defensively against a Soviet invasion. In 1954, the Supreme Commander of the Swedish Armed Forces publicly declared that nuclear weapons were crucial for the country's national security. The Swedish Parliament approved the heavy water plan to convert uranium into plutonium with the new R3 reactor, and they became optimistic that they could get nuclear weapons by the mid-60s. In 1957, Sweden carried out 3 non-nuclear explosive tests in Lapland, detonating 36 tons of conventional explosives to see how nature reacted to a nuclear explosion. Though Sweden signed the Test Ban Treaty, which forbid nuclear testing in the air, sea, and space, this didn't include underground tests, which was a loophole they planned to exploit. By the early 60s, bomb design tests were carried out, implosion charges were simulated on a powerful computer, and the engineers were nearly ready to build a primitive bomb. They just needed the green light from the government and some more plutonium. But as the years went on, public sentiment grew strongly against nuclear weapons, and the military was concerned about the cost and thought that having nukes would make them more of a target. In 1964, something that's still classified shifted the government's stance on nuclear weapons. It's speculated that the US made a secret deal to protect Sweden in the event of a war, but the US was suddenly no longer concerned about Sweden's weapons program. In 1968, Sweden signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and all plans to acquire their own nuclear weapons were dismantled. But some work still continued, and they detonated 10 plutonium rings to study how they would implode. Recently classified documents revealed that when the program ended, it was extremely advanced. They had already built most of a bomb and were only 6 months away from being able to test it, with 2 more bombs being ready shortly after. Due to the amount of work already completed, they are considered a threshold state and could build a nuke in a few years, though its stance is firmly against doing so and is unlikely. Romania had a secret nuclear weapons program that began in 1978 under their communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu. They had an energy program since 1949, but decades later would use the research reactor built with the help of the Soviets to produce nuclear weapons fuel. Though they had signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, they would violate this by secretly trying to develop an atomic bomb. This was called the Danube program, with 3 sections: nuclear weapons, medium-range ballistic missiles, and the third on chemical and biological weapons. They acquired highly enriched uranium and a reactor from the US, which was intended for civilian energy production. A Romanian official who fled to the US revealed that Romania wanted to create a small nuclear weapon, and that Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, offered to finance the research. The Romanian foreign minister also said that Pakistan offered to collaborate on nuclear weapons, which they rejected, and Romania helped India's nuclear weapons program by purchasing 14 tons of heavy water from Norway and secretly shipped it to India in the 80s. Romanian leader Ceausescu also threatened Hungary with nuclear extermination, as the two had tense relations over land disputes. In 1992, the Romanian Revolution executed Ceausescu, and the new government discovered the secret weapons program. It was found they did succeed in creating the nuclear materials for at least 6 bombs, but lacked the scientists to actually make one. The program and reactors were shut down in 1997, and the enriched uranium was returned to Russia in 2009. Though Romania made some progress, they are not considered a threshold state today. Yugoslavia started a nuclear weapons program around 1945, and it was later accelerated after their longtime leader Tito had a falling out with the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Tito wanted them as a protection against a possible Soviet invasion. One of his closest collaborators said, "We must have the atomic bomb. We must build it even if it costs us 1/2 of our income for years." By 1954, a US intelligence report said that the Yugoslavs had commenced a program to produce atomic weapons. After Stalin died, Tito repaired relations with the next Soviet leader Khrushchev, and Moscow provided uranium reactors and heavy water to enrich uranium. They also worked with Norway on plutonium reprocessing and collaborated with Libya and Iraq to develop missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Tito put the program on pause due to the costs, lack of threat from the Soviets, and fear of the program being discovered by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they had signed in 1968. However, after India tested their first nuke in 1974, Tito immediately ordered a new, bigger weapons program centered in Belgrade called Program A, which would be secretly under the cover of an energy one called Program B. This effort continued slowly, but after Tito's death in 1980, the Secretary of Defense accelerated the programs, focusing on creating a Nagasaki-like plutonium bomb. Significant work was done and large amounts of enriched uranium was ready, but a prototype was never produced. For reasons still shrouded in mystery, the government then decided to shut down the weapons program in 1987, though it's believed the main reasons would have been the immense costs, lack of any threat from a hostile nation, and pressure from the US. Yugoslavia's biggest problems were internal, as the country would soon see the brutal Yugoslav wars that broke it into the many nations that exist today. So none of former Yugoslavia would be considered threshold states. Iran's nuclear weapons program is at the center of the world's attention because they are one of the few countries believed to be currently working on obtaining them. There are ongoing negotiations, threats, and fears around this, and Iran has long denied they are working on nuclear weapons, although experts have believed for decades they are extremely close. In 1957, when Iran was under the leadership of the Shah and allied with the United States, they received enriched uranium and reactors from the US strictly for energy purposes. Iran signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, which subjected them to inspections to make sure this technology was not being used for weapons. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution dramatically changed their leadership, and now under the Ayatollahs, Iran became hostile towards the United States and the West. Though the first supreme leader was skeptical of nuclear weapons and viewed them as a Western innovation, the second and current Ayatollah since 1989 became much more interested. Iran discovered natural uranium deposits and received equipment from Abdul Qadir Khan, the father of Pakistan's nuclear program, known for his nuclear smuggling network to Iran, North Korea, and Libya. In the 90s, they also got a reactor from China. In 2002, underground enrichment facilities and heavy water reactors were discovered, and the US publicly accused the Iranians of creating nuclear weapons. The UN imposed asset freezes, embargoes, and sanctions on Iran's nuclear imports, and satellite images revealed military complexes used for high explosive testing and warhead development, while inspections from these sites were denied. The Atomic Energy Agency also reported evidence that Iran had been designing a nuclear bomb. In 2010, it was uncovered that the US and Israel collaborated on a cyber attack called Operation Olympic Games. This infected Iranian nuclear facilities with a cyberworm called Stuxnet. It caused their centrifuges, which processed nuclear material, to burn themselves out, and this destroyed 20% of the centrifuges and infected over 200,000 computers. By 2015, Iran agreed to a deal limiting their nuclear program in exchange for relief from those US sanctions, which weakened Iran's already struggling economy. A few years later, in 2018, US President Trump withdrew from this deal, imposing maximum pressure on Iran through more sanctions, to which Iran continued ramping up their enrichment to levels extremely close to those needed for weapons, and it's widely believed they could achieve this if they wanted to. Whether they do or not depends on the negotiations currently ongoing. In March 2025, the Supreme Leader's top advisor said that Iran would have no choice but to develop nuclear weapons if attacked by the United States or its allies. Iran getting nukes would be massively important to maintain their dominance in the Middle East, and especially against their biggest rival Israel, the only nuclear-armed nation in the region. Iran is considered a threshold state and is very capable of getting atomic weapons and could soon do so. Saudi Arabia has not declared that they are trying to obtain nuclear weapons, but reports have suggested they are currently making steps and definitely have the resources, with their leader Mohammed bin Salman famously saying that without a doubt if Iran gets them, then they will too. Saudi Arabia signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but in 1994, a Saudi diplomat that defected to the United States said that Saudi Arabia started a nuclear weapons program since the Yom Kippur Arab-Israeli War in 1973. He also said that the Saudis supplied funding and technology to Iraq's nuclear weapons program, and after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, The Guardian reported that Saudi Arabia renewed its interest in nuclear weapons. Then in 2005, the New York Times reported that the US President George Bush said to UK Prime Minister Tony Blair that he was open to a preemptive invasion of Saudi Arabia to prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons. In 2003, a classified Saudi document also leaked revealing 3 options: 1, to develop their own atomic bomb, 2, to get one from another nation, or 3, to champion a Middle East nuclear weapons free zone. Evidence then emerged that the Saudis funded nuclear weapons development in Pakistan in exchange for oil credits, and then a senior NATO official claimed to have personally seen intelligence that the Saudis funded Pakistan to develop some nuclear weapons that were ready to be delivered to Riyadh. This indicated that they were exploring option 2, and in response, the Saudi foreign minister neither rejected or confirmed that they might purchase atomic bombs from another country. China also identified that Saudi Arabia contains enough natural uranium ore to produce significant nuclear fuel, and that they are apparently searching for uranium deposits in the northwest region near where they plan to build the Neom City project. The Saudis' nuclear weapons capabilities are shrouded in secrecy as their facilities have not been inspected yet, and they are partially considered a threshold state. Iraq's nuclear weapons program would become one of the biggest controversies in modern history. In the late 60s, Iraq received research reactors and facilities from the Soviet Union for an energy program. In the early 70s, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein ordered the creation of a secret nuclear weapons program helped by Pakistan, who provided centrifuge data. He also created a chemical weapons program under the cover of a pesticide facility with the help from Germany. France later agreed to sell them 72 kilograms of 93% enriched uranium, which is weapons grade, as well as a new reactor called Osirak. In 1981, Israel launched Operation Opera, which bombed and destroyed this reactor while it was under construction, which had been similarly bombed by Iran the year prior during their war. The plant would have eventually been capable of producing weapons-grade material. The United States supported Iraq in its war with Iran, providing $500 million worth of dual-use equipment, some of which would also be used in Iraq's nuclear and chemical weapons programs. The US also taught Iraqi scientists about a shockwave charge typically used to ignite and detonate nuclear bombs. The UK was also involved in what's called the Arms to Iraq scandal, where British companies were endorsed by the government to sell arms to Iraq, which included nuclear bomb triggers, as well as parts for Saddam Hussein's supergun program called Project Babylon that tried to make cannons that could fire projectiles into orbit. Iraq used significant amounts of chemical weapons against hundreds of thousands of Iranians and Kurds during their war. Most of the world initially supported Iraq, wanting to see Iran defeated, but these war crimes changed global opinion on Saddam's regime. The turning point was in 1990 when Iraq invaded neighboring Kuwait, and the US led a coalition of 42 nations, the largest since World War II, to liberate Kuwait during the Gulf War. The coalition pushed Iraq out of Kuwait and completely destroyed what was left of the Osirak nuclear reactor, but stopped short of toppling Saddam Hussein himself. They called a ceasefire and also forbid Iraq from further development of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, which are all generally known as weapons of mass destruction. Inspections confirmed and found significant stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons which were dismantled, and they also found the attempts to develop a nuclear weapon which had not made much progress. Iraq had complied with destroying their WMDs, but inspections had not been carried out for 4 years between 1998 and 2002, and the United States used this to claim they still possessed WMDs. A new inspection from the UN found no evidence of any more WMDs, but regardless, the US's Bush administration famously still claimed Iraq had them and used this to justify a full-scale invasion in 2003. Saddam was removed from power and the war killed hundreds of thousands and is one of the most controversial and condemned wars in history. Despite the US's claims, no WMDs were ever found. Libya signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 under King Idris, but a year later, Muammar Gaddafi seized control of the country and began a nuclear weapons program to counter Israel. In 1981, the Soviet Union provided a research reactor where they carried out illegal uranium conversion with the help of a nuclear-armed country whose name has been kept secret by the Atomic Energy Agency, though it's speculated to be either the Soviet Union or China. Libya also purchased 80 missiles and launchers from the Soviet Union capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Gaddafi used a black market trade network to try and develop them, led by a Swiss nuclear engineer called Frederick Tinner, who was close friends with Abdul Qadir Khan, the father of Pakistan's atomic bomb. The two studied and lived together at a university in Belgium and were both involved in this black market. Gaddafi also once tried to buy tactical nukes from China in the 70s but was refused. Libyan scientists were invited to be involved in Pakistan's nuclear program in 1977, but were soon asked to leave the country as Pakistan changed leadership to one that strongly disliked Gaddafi. Libyan intelligence then tried to infiltrate Pakistan's research facilities but were caught and arrested by Pakistan, who found that Libya had obtained nuclear weapons designs through a smuggling network that originated in China and went through Pakistan. In the 80s, Gaddafi still continued to build the program, but was impacted by sanctions from the US. Gaddafi persuaded the US President Bill Clinton to lift the sanctions by promising to stop his weapons program, though in 95 Gaddafi continued, expanding the black market imports and successfully obtaining centrifuges by the year 2000s, but they struggled to operate them. In 2001, US President George Bush told Gaddafi, either you get rid of your weapons of mass destruction, or we will personally destroy them and destroy everything with no discussion. According to Gaddafi's foreign minister, this was the event that made him decide to end his nuclear weapons program and get rid of his chemical and biological weapons. In 2003, Gaddafi worked with the US, UK, and Russia to dismantle his nuclear weapons project, and they discovered dozens of secret facilities. The Swiss scientists leading Gaddafi's program, as well as his sons, were arrested by the US, and one son claimed that they were CIA informants. By the time it was discovered, Libya's nuclear weapons program was still in very early stages, estimated by the Atomic Energy Agency to be still 3 to 7 years away from completing an atomic bomb. Gaddafi was later unhappy with the Western response to his disarmament and held on to some nuclear material and chemical weapons to try and use them for leverage. Though after the Arab Spring, a civil war broke out and NATO forces aided Libyan rebels who would overthrow and brutally execute Gaddafi. Syria had signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty since 1969 and tried to buy reactors from China, Russia, Argentina, India, and others, but these were blocked by the International Atomic Energy Agency and pressure from the US and Israel. Since the 2000s, Syria was suspected of having a secret nuclear weapons program in a facility under construction that contained a reactor with parts from North Korea. This plant looks nearly identical to one in North Korea used to create their nuclear weapons. This concerned Syria's neighbor and major rival Israel, who in 2007 launched Operation Outside the Box, where 8 planes destroyed the facility and killed 10 North Korean workers inside. The Atomic Energy Agency also confirmed it was an undeclared nuclear reactor and found traces of processed uranium, and US intelligence indicated it did have a military purpose and was capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium. There was little international backlash of this bombing as all parties kept quiet about it. Syria didn't want to admit they secretly had a nuclear facility, and Israel didn't want to admit to attacking another nation. Since the Syrian civil war and the fall of the Assad regime, they are not considered capable of obtaining nuclear weapons. Japan had multiple nuclear weapons projects during World War II and today is described as the most capable country in the world at creating them. The first Japanese program officially began in 1941 in Tokyo, though they initially believed that not even the United States could create one in time to influence the war, so the Navy lost interest. The army continued and focused on separating uranium but struggled for years. By 1945, the building where this was being done was destroyed by a US bombing run. The Navy had also later started a second project in Kyoto but wouldn't get beyond the theoretical stage. The US later captured a German submarine destined for Japan that contained enough uranium for 20% of an atomic bomb, and after Japan's surrender, the US also found 5 cyclotrons capable of creating weapons-grade uranium, which they smashed and dumped into the Tokyo harbor. There was a report in 1946 that alleged Japan had tested an atomic bomb in their occupied Korea, according to a Japanese officer, but many independent investigations have dismissed these claims for lacking evidence. Since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan has been fiercely against nuclear weapons, but after China tested their first in 1964, the Japanese Prime Minister said to US President Lyndon B. Johnson that if the Chinese communists had nuclear weapons, then the Japanese should also have them, which shocked the US. Japan then adopted the 3 non-nuclear principles which don't allow the production, possession, or hosting of such weapons, but this relies on assurance that the US will protect them, and if they don't, then Japan would have no choice but to acquire nukes. The US also stored around 1,200 nuclear warheads in Okinawa until 1970, which it occupied. Japan signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, but maintained that they will still learn how to theoretically make atomic weapons in case they ever needed to. Though Japanese public opinion of them are still taboo, the growing threats of China and North Korea have been slightly increasing public support for the idea. Japan's former Prime Minister said that Japan should consider hosting US nukes for deterrence. Today, Japan is considered as the most capable of all the threshold states, with the resources to create a bomb in less than a year and enough plutonium for thousands of warheads. This alone acts as a very strong deterrent, as Japan is considered a virtual nuclear weapons state. Taiwan arguably came closer than any non-nuclear country to successfully getting an atom bomb, having designed a complete weapon, obtained all the materials, and conducting a cold test. After China tested their first nuke in 1964, Taiwan started its secret nuclear weapons program in 1967. They acquired the same reactor from Canada that India used to get their nukes, as well as 100 tons of uranium from South Africa and plutonium from the US, all given strictly for energy purposes but would be secretly used to try and make a bomb. The US also stored its nukes in Taiwan during the Cold War until 1974. They succeeded in producing weapons-grade plutonium using heavy water reactors, but after the Atomic Energy Agency discovered this, Taiwan agreed in 1976 to end its weapons program. However, a new secret program would be started again in the 80s. They bought another 4,000 tons of uranium from South Africa. The aim was to try and build a device they were sure would work without needing to test it, out of fear of the consequences. They used computers to simulate how a nuclear test would work, slamming uranium plates together at high speed to make it look like they were testing anti-tank projectiles. In 1986, after nearly 20 years of research and simulated tests, multiple reports claimed Taiwan successfully tested a very small nuclear device in the Jiupeng military field that was recorded by a US satellite. Though this wasn't a full-scale bomb and is considered a cold test, a Taiwanese general later claimed that they had produced a controlled nuclear reaction, and he was likely referring to this test. In 1987, a Taiwanese colonel who led their nuclear program and was a CIA informant defected to the US and revealed the extent of their work. The US then pressured Taiwan to stop their program, which intel showed was only 1 to 2 years away from completion. They had designed a large bomb capable of being tested but would need to be made smaller to be dropped by a plane. Taiwan isn't currently recognized by the UN as a sovereign nation, so it can't sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it has signed unique agreements with the US and Atomic Energy Agency. Taiwan is widely considered as one of the most technologically advanced nations in the world, and based on their past weapons program, is also a threshold state that could develop nukes in a year or two. But doing so would be extremely dangerous and almost certainly provoke a full-scale invasion from China, who has been promising to annex or reunify it for 20 years. South Korea made small efforts towards nuclear weapons and today is one of the more capable threshold states that has recently shown more interest in obtaining their own. After the Korean War in the late 50s to early 60s, the US stationed nearly 1,000 of its own nuclear weapons in South Korea. In 1970, right after the US announced they would withdraw its forces from South Korea, they first considered the possibility of starting their own nuclear program. Then, as South Vietnam fell to the Communist North in 1975, the South Korean president publicly mentioned desires to get nuclear weapons and a secret program had begun. They got a research reactor from the US provided for energy as well as technology from France and Belgium. They also attempted to get plutonium reprocessing facilities from France, but the US stopped this. South Korea publicly ended their program after that. However, some work would still continue as in 1982, they extracted more plutonium and the US again persuaded them to stop in exchange for helping their nuclear energy program. It was later revealed that they still continued reprocessing spent fuel, and in the 90s the US withdrew its nukes from South Korea. In the year 2000, they again enriched some more uranium to 77%, which is very close to weapons grade. North Korea successfully tested its first nuclear bomb in 2006. After a period of high tensions between the two, the South Korean defense minister said it was worth considering the US hosting nukes there again. By 2023, the US agreed to periodically place nuclear-armed submarines there in exchange for South Korea agreeing not to develop their own. However, public opinion among South Koreans is in favor of them creating their own, with over 76% supporting the idea in 2023. South Korea has plenty of resources to make atomic weapons if they wanted to, and is the only nation without nukes that have submarines capable of launching them. It's estimated they could create one in a year or two. Whether they do or not depends on whether the US continues to provide their nuclear umbrella. Myanmar, previously called Burma until 1989, had a small nuclear weapons program secretly aided by North Korea. In 2009, two high-ranking Myanmar officials defected to Australia, and the Sydney Morning Herald reported that Myanmar was working on a secret nuclear weapons program, which initially aimed to be completed by 2014. This was allegedly being helped by North Korea and involved a nuclear reactor and plutonium extraction facilities hidden in caves tunneled into a mountain. In 2010, a 5-year investigation using documents provided by a major in Myanmar's military found evidence they had begun a weapons program. The UN also found evidence that North Korea had been helping them, but experts believe they were still a long way from succeeding considering their lack of resources. The US expressed concern in 2011 but stated their fears were later diminished. Myanmar has also since said they have halted their nuclear energy program and they did not have the means to make or use a nuclear weapon. They initially denied cooperation with North Korea, but their president later told US President Barack Obama that they did have some relations with North Korea because they needed someone to help with defense. Myanmar signed a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons in 2018 and is yet to ratify it, but is not considered a threshold state and cannot easily make them. Brazil came very close to obtaining a nuclear weapon, with 2 being designed and a site ready for them to be tested. Since the 1950s, the president expressed interest in developing nukes, and the country was under a military dictatorship since 1964, who started a secret project called the Parallel Program in the 70s. It involved the Army, Navy, and Air Force in competition with their rival Argentina. This included enrichment plants, reprocessing, and a missile program, with highly enriched uranium being purchased from China in the 80s. They also got equipment from West Germany, France, and the US, which was all meant for energy. Brazil also has the 6th largest reserves of natural uranium and secretly exported 8 tons of it to Iraq in 1981 for their program. By 1987, the president announced that they had enriched uranium to 20%. Later investigations found that they had successfully designed 2 bombs, one with a yield of 20 to 30 kilotons, which is larger than the one dropped on Nagasaki, and a second with 12 kilotons, which is smaller than the one dropped on Hiroshima. They had also prepared a test site, which was a large military area in the Amazon called Cachimbo. This had a 320 meters deep hole, and according to a Brazilian military officer, a nuclear bomb was planned to be tested in it in 1990. They had the facilities to make enough weapons-grade material, but were still a few years away from producing enough for the bombs. However, in the late 80s, Brazil transitioned from a military dictatorship to more of a democracy which was against nuclear weapons. In 1990, the new president closed the test site and shut down the weapons program for good by symbolically pouring concrete down the shaft using a shovel. By 91, Brazil and Argentina signed agreements of disarmament, and Brazil signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 97. Experts concluded that due to Brazil's significant work, they could produce a nuclear weapon within 3 years if they decided to, making them a threshold state and the most capable in Latin America. Argentina had a small nuclear weapons program inspired by its rivalry with Brazil. Limited work began in the 80s under a military dictatorship when they discovered Brazil was also pursuing them. During Argentina's Falklands War with the UK, the US became concerned that the Argentines could build a nuclear bomb using its energy program. This was also the height of when Argentina and its citizens desired them, as some believe the outcome of the Falklands War may have been different if they were a nuclear-armed nation. Their program was mainly focused on energy, supported by getting reactors from Canada and West Germany, a heavy water plant from Switzerland, and nuclear equipment from the Soviet Union. The Argentinian government confirmed in 1983 that their research did have the capacity to make weapons-grade uranium, but any interest was soon abandoned when a new government transitioned into a democracy and opposed nukes. They also had a better relationship with Brazil by this time and saw no need to continue their rivalry. Today, Argentina is not considered a threshold state, as they were never seriously trying to obtain atomic weapons besides the ability to make fuel. There were also other countries that made very small efforts but never had an actual program. Australia tried to get some tactical nukes from the US and UK but were denied and gave up, deciding that they would be too difficult to make on their own. Algeria has an energy program and was accused of wanting weapons, but no strong evidence was found. Egypt under Abdel Nasser seriously wanted nukes in response to Israel, but was denied help from the Soviet Union. Italy is a threshold state that can easily make them and hosts US nukes today. They briefly tried to get their own, but the US pressured them not to. Turkey is another threshold state that also hosts US nukes, and they considered making their own a few times but haven't yet. The Philippines wanted them, and the US stored some there briefly during the Cold War, and Indonesia sought some from China and the Soviet Union but never received any. There is a recurring theme that the US, as the first country to develop nuclear weapons and the only country to use them, is consistently the main one that have stopped almost every country on this list from getting them. Some would consider that a good thing, as the less nukes in the world the better, but the US is also criticized for policing who can have this technology. However, circumstances could rapidly change and we could see more nuclear-armed nations in the near future.